She got stuck with the billionaire in the office revolving door before a huge meeting, forcing him to make his multi-million-dollar presentation from inside it. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, what's the most awkward or inconvenient place you've ever been stuck? And at the end of the story, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Enjoy. The sound wasn't loud. It wasn't a crash or a bang. It was a soft, final, and deeply insulting thunk. A sound that suggested a decision had been made and no amount of argument would change it. For a wild second, Flora Daniels thought the entire gleaming city of Chicago had collectively decided to hold its breath. Then she realized the stillness was much more personal. She was trapped. She looked through the curved glass in front of her, a potted fern looking smug. She looked through the curved glass behind her. A man in a suit so sharp it could have sliced cheese. His expression a perfect blend of surprise and outrage. They were two halves of a very strange, very stationary whole, caught like butterflies in a glass jar in the revolving door of Kendall Industries Tower. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," Flora muttered to the universe, her voice muffled in the small, sterile space. She gave the brass push bar a tentative shove. It didn't budge, not an inch. It was like trying to push a mountain. From the other compartment, the man in the suit did the same. His shove was less tentative and more commanding, as if he expected the door to apologize and obey. It did not. He grunted, a sound of pure frustration. "Any luck over there, champ?" Flora called out, her voice tinny. His head snapped up, his brilliant blue eyes narrowing, as if just now realizing he wasn't alone in his predicament. "It's jammed," he stated, his voice a low baritone that seemed too big for the space. It was the kind of voice that announced quarterly earnings and didn't take questions. "No? Really? I thought maybe we were part of a new art installation," Flora retorted, her own frustration bubbling up. "It's called corporate despair, in glass and steel." A muscle twitched in his jaw. He was clearly a man who did not appreciate sarcasm before 10 in the morning. Or possibly ever. He pulled out a phone that looked more expensive than her car, tapped the screen with irritated precision, and then scowled. No signal. Of course, it's a veritable Faraday cage. Flora patted her own pockets, which contained her phone, a half-eaten roll of mints, and a healthy dose of regret for not taking the regular door. "Well, this is just peachy. I feel like a prize hamster in a pet store window. Do you think they'll give us one of those little water bottles?" He ignored her, instead pressing his palm flat against the glass facing the lobby and knocking sharply. A security guard, who looked about as motivated as a sloth on a Sunday afternoon, glanced over, gave a lazy shrug, and then went back to reading his newspaper. The man growled, his voice vibrating with disbelief. "Is he serious?" "I think his name is Sal," Flora offered. "He's usually more concerned with the structural integrity of his donut than the building." "You're not going to get his attention unless you're on fire. And even then, it's a toss-up." The man gave the glass another, harder rap, his jaw set. Sal didn't even look up this time. He just turned a page. "See? All the urgency of a snail crossing a highway," Flora sighed, slumping against the glass. This was not how her day was supposed to go. She was here for a final round interview. Head florist for the building's corporate events. A long shot, but it was her dream shot. She'd spent an hour arranging and rearranging the sample bouquet in her portfolio, a cascade of blush peonies and silver-dollar eucalyptus. Now she was probably going to miss the interview entirely and be known forever as the woman trapped in the door. The man, meanwhile, was checking his watch, a sleek silver affair that probably had its own stock portfolio. Unbelievable. This is simply unbelievable. "Look on the bright side," Flora said, trying to cheer herself up more than him. "At least we have a nice view, and it's climate-controlled." He finally turned his full attention to her, his gaze sweeping over her simple blue t-shirt and dark trousers with a look of clinical assessment. "There is no bright side. I have a meeting in," he checked the watch again, "exactly 12 minutes. A meeting upon which the entire next fiscal year of this company depends." Flora's eyebrows shot up. "This company? As in Kendall Industries?" "As in this is my name on the building," he confirmed. His tone clipped. "Stetson Kendall. And I am currently trapped in my own front door." Of course, Stetson Kendall. The boy genius, the titan of tech, the man whose face was plastered on every business magazine with headlines like the Midas of the Midwest. Flora had seen pictures, but they didn't do the in-person intensity justice. He looked like a movie star from the 50s, a Cary Grant type. If Cary Grant had spent his weekends wrestling bears and winning, and she had just been calling him champ and comparing him to a hamster. "Flora Daniels," she said, her voice a little smaller than before, "and I'm currently trapped with your name on the building. It's a pleasure." He gave a short, humorless huff. "The pleasure is all mine, I assure you." He began to pace, which was a comical feat in a space the size of a phone booth, taking one step, turning, and taking one step back. There has to be a manual override, a fail-safe. This is a billion-dollar building, for heaven's sake, not a screen door on a farmhouse. "You know," Flora mused, watching him, "this feels like an episode of The Twilight Zone. The one where the people are trapped somewhere perfectly normal, but they can't get out, and it slowly drives them mad. Any minute now, Rod Serling is going to step out from behind that fern and start narrating our impending doom." Stetson stopped his frantic one-step pacing and stared at her. "Who? Rod Serling? Host of The Twilight Zone? Black and white TV, creepy music, twist endings?" She tried to hum the iconic theme song. "Do-do-do-do, do-do-do-do." He just blinked at her, his expression utterly blank. "I don't have time for do-do-do-do, Miss Daniels. I have to close a 9-figure deal with the Mitsui Group from Japan. They are, at this moment, sitting in my boardroom on the 80th floor, expecting me to walk in and blow them away with a presentation I've been working on for 6 months. 9 figures? Flora whistled. "That's a lot of dough. What are you selling them? The moon?" "A proprietary logistics algorithm that will revolutionize global shipping," he said, as if reciting it from memory. "And if I'm not there, the deal is off. My COO, for all his talents, does not have the final sign-off authority. They flew 12 hours to see me." Just then, a man in a suit almost as sharp as Stetson's rushed toward the door from the lobby, his face a mask of pure panic. He was followed by a delegation of impeccably dressed Japanese businessmen who looked calm, but with an underlying current of immense seriousness. The man in the suit, who Flora guessed was the COO, pressed his face close to the glass, his eyes wide. He started making frantic gestures. "Oh good," Flora said dryly. "Mime, my favorite way to receive critical information." Stetson pressed his own ear to the glass. "What is it, Arthur? Can you hear me?" Arthur shook his head, then pulled out a pen and scribbled on his notepad. He held it up to the glass. The writing was backward. "For crying out loud, Arthur, write it so I can read it?" Stetson barked, though the sound was likely just a dull thud on the other side. Arthur, flustered, tried again. This time, Flora could make it out. "Door malfunction. Maintenance says 1 hour, minimum." Stetson Kendall looked like he was going to be physically ill. He leaned his forehead against the cool glass, closing his eyes. 1 hour, he whispered. It sounded like a death sentence. The Japanese businessmen were now looking at their own watches, their polite smiles beginning to strain. This was a disaster. A 9-figure, international, epic disaster. Flora watched the scene unfold. The frantic COO, the stoic investors, the billionaire trapped in a glass tube. It was absurd. It was catastrophic. And suddenly, a completely insane, utterly ridiculous idea sparked in her mind. It was the kind of idea you get when you've had too little sleep and too much coffee, but right now, it was all she had. "Well," she said, her voice cutting through his despair, "it looks like you're going to have to do it from in here." Stetson's head snapped up. His blue eyes, which had been clouded with defeat, were now sharp with disbelief. "Do what from in here? Go mad." "The presentation," Flora said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "You're the main event, right? The show must go on, even if the stage is a little minimalist." He stared at her as if she had just suggested they learn to photosynthesize. "You want me to deliver the most important presentation of my career from inside a revolving door? What other choice do you have?" She countered, her confidence growing. "You can stand here and pace a hole in your expensive shoes for an hour and watch that 9-figure deal walk out the door, or you can pivot. Isn't that what you business titans are always talking about? Pivoting? Adapting? Well, mister, it's time to pivot." He was still staring, but now a different light was in his eyes. It wasn't disbelief anymore. It was a flicker of something else. Calculation. Maybe even a sliver of grudging respect. He looked out at the investors, then at his frantic COO, then back at Flora. He saw the logic. The insane, humiliating, career-defining logic. "Arthur," he yelled, his voice muffled but urgent. He pointed to his tablet, which Arthur was clutching like a lifeline. "The tablet and the clicker! Bring them here!" Arthur looked confused but nodded, rushing to the edge of the door. There was a small, document-sized slot at the bottom of the glass pane, probably for mail delivery after hours. It was just big enough. "You're a genius or a madwoman, Miss Daniels," Stetson said, a wry, almost smile touching his lips for the first time. "Most days, I'm a little bit of both," Flora replied, her heart starting to beat a little faster. Arthur slid the sleek tablet and a small remote through the slot. Stetson snatched them up. He looked at the tablet, then at the investors, then at Flora. His suit was perfect, his hair was perfect, but there was a wild look in his eyes now. A look of a man about to jump out of a plane without a parachute, relying on sheer force of will to land safely. He took a deep breath. "I'm going to need an assistant," he said, his voice low and serious. Flora just raised an eyebrow. "Funny, I don't see anyone else in here." He handed her the tablet. It felt cool and heavy in her hands. "I need you to hold this. Steady. And I need you to swipe to the next slide when I give you a subtle nod, like this." He gave a short, almost imperceptible dip of his chin. "Not before, not after. Exactly on the nod. Can you do that?" "Mister, for a front row seat to a 9-figure pitch from inside a revolving door?" "I can do anything you want," she said, a grin playing on her lips. She glanced at the first slide, a dense wall of text and charts. "But just a suggestion, you might want to skip this one. It looks like the fine print on a tax form. You'll put them to sleep before you even say hello." He frowned, looking at the slide. "That's the Q2 revenue projection overview. It's critical context." "It's boring," Flora stated plainly. "You're in a glass cage. You've already lost their focus. You need to get it back with a bang, not a whimper. What's the money shot? The big finish? Show them the magic trick first, then explain how you did it." Stetson stared at the tablet, then at her, his mind clearly racing. He swiped through a dozen slides, his thumb a blur, until he landed on a stunning 3D graphic of a container ship, with glowing lines of data crisscrossing the globe. It was beautiful, simple, and powerful. "Start there," Flora whispered. "Hook them. Then you can reel them in with your Q2 projections." He looked at her for a long, silent moment. She could practically hear the gears turning in his brilliant mind. He, the Midas of the Midwest, was taking presentation advice from a woman he'd met 5 minutes ago in a jammed door. Slowly, deliberately, he nodded. "All right, Miss Daniels," he said, his voice dropping into its formal presentation mode. "Let's give them a show they'll never forget." He straightened his tie, squared his shoulders, and turned to face his audience on the other side of the glass. The investors, the COO, and now a growing crowd of employees were all staring, their faces a mixture of confusion and rapt attention. This was either going to be the biggest train wreck in corporate history or the most legendary business pitch of all time. Flora held the tablet steady, her knuckles white. She caught Stetson's eye one last time. He gave her that subtle nod, but this time there was a ghost of a real smile with it. A smile that said, "Here we go." He raised his voice, projecting it with all the power he could muster. "Good morning, gentlemen," Stetson Kendall began, his voice echoing slightly in their glass prison. "Apologies for the unconventional venue. Let's talk about the future of global shipping." The silence on the other side of the glass was absolute. Stetson Kendall had just delivered his opening line, and the assembled crowd, a mix of high-stakes investors and his own bewildered employees, seemed to be collectively processing the sheer absurdity of the situation. Flora held the tablet with the grip of a bomb disposal technician, her gaze fixed on Stetson. For a man trapped in what was essentially a vertical hamster wheel, he radiated an astonishing amount of authority. "He's got their attention. I'll give him that," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Nobody's checking their phones." "That's the easy part," Stetson murmured back without moving his lips, his eyes locked on the lead investor, a stern-looking man named Mr. Tanaka. "Now I have to keep it." He gave her the almost invisible nod. Flora's thumb swiped across the screen. The stunning 3D graphic of the globe lit up the tablet. Stetson launched into his pitch, his voice a smooth, confident river of data and vision. He spoke of efficiency, of predictive analytics, of shaving microseconds off transoceanic voyages that would translate into billions in revenue. He was magnificent. He was also, Flora realized, starting to sound like a computer. "You're losing them," she whispered urgently, seeing Mr. Tanaka's eyes glaze over slightly. "Too much jargon. Talk to them like they're people, not calculators." "This is how you talk to investors, Miss Daniels," he hissed back, a faint line of sweat beading on his temple. "Is it? Because from where I'm standing, which is admittedly way too close, it looks like you're lulling them into a very expensive nap," she countered. "Remember what Ed Sullivan used to do?" He shot her a look of pure confusion. "The guy with the puppets?" "The guy who knew how to work a crowd," she corrected. "He'd bring on the Beatles and the world would change. He knew you needed a show, not just a lecture. You're the Beatles, Stetson. This algorithm is your hit single. Stop reading the liner notes and play the music." Something in her slightly scrambled metaphor must have landed. He paused for a fraction of a second, took a breath, and then broke from his script. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice changing, becoming more personal. "Forget the numbers for a moment. Let me tell you a story." He pointed a finger at the glowing ship on the tablet Flora was holding. "This ship, the Wandering Star, left Singapore 2 weeks ago. My algorithm predicted, with 99.7% accuracy, that it would hit a freak squall in the Indian Ocean. We rerouted it. The shipping company saved 3 days and, more importantly, 150 containers of critical medical supplies arrived in them. He had them." The investors leaned forward. This was a story. This was tangible. "You're a natural," Flora breathed, a genuine smile touching her lips. "I have a good coach," he admitted, his eyes flicking to her for a split second. A silent thank you. A moment of shared victory. They were in this together. He nodded again. Flora swiped. The next slide was a dense financial chart. Before he could even open his mouth, she shook her head almost imperceptibly. "What?" he mouthed silently. She tapped a finger on the corner of the tablet, on a small, embedded photo of a smiling dockworker. "Talk about him," she mouthed back. Stetson looked at the photo, then back at her, a silent argument passing between them. He clearly wanted to talk about amortization schedules. She was telling him to talk about a person. He bit the bullet. "This is a man named Carlos," Stetson said, his voice finding that storytelling rhythm again. "He's a logistics manager in the port of Los Angeles. Before our system, he spent 60% of his day dealing with paperwork errors and tracking delays. Now," he nodded at Flora. She swiped. The next slide showed a video of the same man laughing with his colleagues. "Now he spends that time optimizing routes and getting his crew home to their families earlier. We're not just moving boxes, gentlemen, we're improving lives." A low murmur of approval went through the Japanese delegation. Mr. Tanaka nodded slowly, a real smile finally gracing his features. Flora felt a ridiculous surge of pride. They were a team, a well-oiled, perfectly in sync, temporarily incarcerated team. She was so caught up in the moment that she almost missed Stetson's next subtle nod. She swiped a little too late. "My apologies," Stetson covered smoothly. "A slight technical glitch in our presentation suite." The crowd chuckled. The absurdity of his comment, delivered from inside a glass cylinder, broke the tension completely. "Suite is a strong word," Flora whispered, adjusting her grip. "It's more of a closet with delusions of grandeur." "Work with me, Daniels," he murmured, a hint of humor in his own voice. They found their rhythm after that. He would speak, she would anticipate the slide, he would weave in the human element she silently prompted, and she would hold the tablet as if it were the crown jewels. They moved like dancers who had practiced for weeks, not strangers who had met minutes ago. It was like watching Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, if Ginger had to provide the dance floor and Fred was pitching a logistics empire. Suddenly, a new figure appeared in the crowd. A man with slicked back hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He stood next to Arthur, the COO, and folded his arms, a smug look on his face. He looked like the villain in a teen movie from the 80s. "Who is the pinstriped weasel?" Flora whispered. Stetson's jaw tightened. "Garrett Stone, my head of acquisitions. He's been trying to steal this deal out from under me for months. He's enjoying the show." "Well, we can't have that," Flora muttered. She noticed Stetson was about to launch into another data-heavy section. As he gave the nod, she didn't swipe. He shot her a questioning look. She subtly tilted the tablet toward a slide further down the presentation, a map of Japan with dozens of glowing dots. She raised her eyebrows, a silent suggestion. "Make it personal for them." Stetson understood instantly. He skipped 5 slides worth of material. "And now, Mr. Tanaka," he said, his voice booming with renewed energy, "let's discuss what this means for you, for Mitsui, for Japan." Flora swiped. The map of Japan filled the screen. "Our algorithm has already identified over 200 optimization points within your existing domestic shipping lanes alone," Stetson declared, his finger tracing a line on the glass as if he were pointing to a massive screen behind him. "We project a 22% increase in efficiency in the first 6 months. That's not just a number. That is Japanese goods getting to the global market faster. That is your company solidifying its position as a world leader." Mr. Tanaka's eyes widened. This was the masterstroke. Stetson was no longer selling a product. He was selling a vision of Japanese dominance, powered by Kendall Industries. Garrett Stone's smug smile faltered. It was brilliant, and it was Flora's idea. Stetson was in the zone, his passion for the project radiating from him. He was gesturing, pointing, his voice rising and falling with dramatic cadence. He was a force of nature. And then he stopped, mid-sentence. He looked down at the tablet. A small, red, blinking icon had appeared in the corner of the screen. The battery symbol. It was at 5%. "Oh, fiddlesticks," Flora whispered. "Fiddlesticks doesn't quite cover it, Daniels," Stetson said through clenched teeth. "Houston, we have a problem." "Finally, a reference I get," she shot back. "How long do we have?" "Minutes, maybe." The presentation was only 2/3 complete. The most crucial part, the financial breakdown and the final call to action, was yet to come. Stetson subtly tried to signal Arthur, tapping the tablet and pointing. Arthur, bless his panicked heart, thought he was asking for water. He scurried off. "He's going to come back with a bottle of Fiji that won't fit through the mail slot." Stetson groaned, resting his head against the glass for a second. "We're sunk." "No, we're not," Flora said, her mind racing. She thought of her grandfather, a man who could fix anything with duct tape and a can-do attitude. He always said the best tool was the one between your ears. "You don't need that thing. It has my notes, my projections, my closing argument." "You've been working on this for 6 months, you said. You know it backwards and forwards. You are the presentation, Stetson. The tablet is just a crutch." She looked him directly in the eye. "Look at them. They're not looking at the tablet. They're looking at you. They're captivated by the man in the glass box. Don't lose them now." Her use of his first name hung in the air between them. It was a slip, but it felt right. They had moved past formalities. Arthur returned, holding up a bottle of water and a power bank. As predicted, the power bank was a thick brick that had 0 chance of fitting through the slot. Stetson let out a sigh of pure defeat. "This is it," Flora said, her voice firm and low. "This is your I Love Lucy moment." He stared at her. "What on earth are you talking about now?" "The chocolate factory," she said, her eyes gleaming. "The conveyor belt is speeding up, and the chocolates are coming too fast. You can't keep up. You can either panic and stuff them in your mouth, or you can do what Lucy never could. Turn off the machine and just be brilliant." He didn't understand the reference, but he understood the message. Improvise. Adapt. Overcome. The tablet screen went black. The battery was dead. The investors stirred, sensing a problem. Garrett Stone's smirk returned, wider than ever. Stetson looked at the dead screen in Flora's hands, then at her determined face. He took a breath that seemed to pull in all the air in their tiny compartment. He straightened up, a new kind of fire in his eyes. He was done with crutches. He turned to the investors and gave them a disarmingly charming smile. "It seems my technology has decided to take a dramatic pause," he announced, his voice smooth as silk. "But that's all right. The most important technology isn't on a screen. It's in our minds. It's the ability to see a better future." He moved closer to the glass, his presence filling the space, creating an intimacy that a boardroom never could. "Let me paint you a picture, gentlemen. No slides, no charts, just a conversation." And he did. He spoke of the future, of a world connected more seamlessly than ever before. He laid out the financial projections from memory, not as cold numbers, but as the foundation of a new global partnership. He was better without the tablet. He was more passionate, more real, more human. Flora watched, completely mesmerized. He wasn't a CEO anymore, he was a visionary. And she was the one who had pushed him off the cliff, forcing him to realize he could fly. He ended his speech with a simple, powerful statement. Together, we can chart the course for the next century of commerce. The only question is, are you ready to set sail? A profound silence fell over the lobby. It stretched for 1 second, then 2. Then, led by Mr. Tanaka, the entire Japanese delegation broke into a firm, resounding round of applause. Arthur looked like he was going to weep with joy. Garrett Stone looked like he had just swallowed a lemon. Stetson's shoulders, which had been tense for the entire ordeal, finally relaxed. He sagged slightly against the glass, the adrenaline leaving him in a rush. He turned to Flora, a look of sheer, unadulterated disbelief and gratitude on his face. "Daniels," he started, his voice husky. "You." "Don't say it," she interrupted, a giddy laugh bubbling up. "We were a good team. Like salt and pepper, peanut butter and jelly." "Like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid," he offered, a real, genuine smile finally breaking through his composed facade. It transformed his whole face, making him look younger, happier. Flora's heart did a little flip. "You know that one? I'm a billionaire, not a caveman," he chuckled. "I have seen a movie or two." Their laughter filled the small space, a warm, private sound in the midst of the public spectacle. They had done it. They had pulled off the impossible. For a moment, they weren't a CEO and a florist. They were just Stetson and Flora, partners in the most ridiculous, high-stakes presentation ever given. And then, with the same sudden finality as before, came a sound. Not a thunk, but a loud metallic clank. A shudder ran through the door. It was over. Freedom, and the real world, was just one push away. The metallic clank of the door unlocking echoed louder than the applause. For a heartbeat, neither Stetson nor Flora moved. Their shared space, which had felt like a prison minutes ago, now felt like a strangely protective bubble. Out there was the world, with its rules and hierarchies. In here, they were just a team. Butch and Sundance. He was the brilliant visionary. She was the plucky strategist who told him when his PowerPoints were boring. The thought made a hysterical giggle rise in Flora's throat, which she quickly suppressed. Stetson cleared his throat, the sound pulling them both back to reality. The magic was over. He was Mr. Kendall again. She was still Flora Daniels, but now with a much better story for her grandkids. He gave the push bar a tentative nudge. It swung forward with silent, mocking ease. "Freedom. After you," he said, his voice once again layered with that formal CEO polish. It was a slight shift, but Flora felt it like a drop in temperature. "Oh no, I insist," she said, plastering on a bright, polite smile. "It's your building. You should probably exit your own door first. Show it who's boss." A flicker of their earlier rapport sparked in his eyes. "I think it's already made that abundantly clear." He pushed his side of the door open and stepped out into the cavernous lobby. The real world rushed in. Arthur, the COO, was on him instantly, clapping him on the shoulder, relief washing over his face. "Stetson, my goodness, are you all right? That was unorthodox," Stetson finished for him, straightening his tie as if he'd just stepped out of a normal meeting. Mr. Tanaka and his delegation approached, their faces alight with admiration. "Mr. Kendall," Mr. Tanaka said, bowing slightly. "In my 40 years in business, I have never witnessed a presentation with such tenacity. You have not only sold us a product, you have shown us the character of the man behind it. We are in." He extended his hand. Stetson shook it firmly, a magnetic smile locking into place. "Mr. Tanaka, I am honored. This is the beginning of a magnificent partnership." Flora slipped out of her side of the door, expecting to be as invisible as the potted fern. She had served her purpose. Now it was time to fade into the background and try to salvage her actual reason for being here. She smoothed down her t-shirt, suddenly feeling incredibly underdressed. Everyone around her was in a suit that cost more than her rent. She felt like a stray cat that had wandered into the Westminster Dog Show. As handshakes and congratulations were exchanged, she started to sidle away toward the elevator bank, her portfolio clutched to her chest. Well, if it isn't the hero of the hour. The voice was smooth, with an undercurrent of something sharp and unpleasant, like honey mixed with glass shards. It was Garrett Stone. He had positioned himself directly in her path, blocking her escape. "I'm sorry?" Flora said, blinking. "The presentation," Garrett clarified, his smile widening. "Quite a performance. Our Mr. Kendall always did have a flair for the dramatic, and you were the perfect little prop, a damsel in the glass tower, very cinematic." The condescension in his voice was thick enough to stand a spoon in. He was dismissing her, reducing her role to a decorative accident. Flora's spine stiffened. "I was just holding the tablet," she said with a cool sweetness. "It was very heavy, all those 9-figure numbers, you know." Garrett's smile tightened. "Cute. You're quick, I'll give you that. But let me give you a piece of free advice, sweetheart. This is the big leagues. Your little 15 minutes of fame are over. Run along now before you get hurt." "Garrett," Stetson's voice cut through the air like a razor. The handshakes had stopped, the murmuring had ceased. He had turned and his blue eyes were fixed on his head of acquisitions with an Arctic chill. "Just congratulating your assistant," Garrett said, his tone shifting to one of feigned camaraderie. "She was a real trooper." Stetson took 2 steps forward, closing the distance until he was standing beside Flora. He didn't just stand next to her, he created a united front. It was a subtle but unmistakable gesture of alignment. "Miss Daniels was not my assistant," Garrett, Stetson said, his voice calm but carrying a lethal weight. "And she was certainly not a prop. Miss Daniels was my crisis management consultant." A ripple of confusion went through the onlookers. Flora herself stared at him, her mouth slightly agape. "Crisis management consultant?" "She provided on-the-fly strategic redirection that was instrumental in securing the Mitsui partnership," Stetson continued, looking directly at Mr. Tanaka. "Her ability to cut through the noise and identify the core emotional narrative was, and I do not say this lightly, the pivot upon which this entire deal turned." Mr. Tanaka's gaze shifted to Flora, his expression now one of profound respect. He stepped forward and bowed to her, even deeper than he had to Stetson. "Miss Daniels," the investor said, his English precise, "your wisdom is as impressive as your courage. It is an honor." Flora felt a blush creep up her neck. She was just a florist who liked old movies. "Oh, well, thank you, sir. I just told him to stop being boring." The investors laughed, a warm, genuine sound this time. Stetson's mouth quirked into a smile. Even Garrett looked momentarily stunned into silence, his little power play having backfired spectacularly. He had tried to put Flora in her place, and Stetson had responded by building her a throne. "Arthur," Stetson commanded, turning to his COO, "please escort Mr. Tanaka and his team to the executive lounge. We'll sign the final papers there. And Garrett," he added, his eyes narrowing once more, "my office. In an hour. We need to discuss your definition of teamwork." Garrett's face paled. He gave a stiff nod and retreated into the crowd, his smugness replaced by a distinct look of panic. As Arthur led the triumphant investors away, the crowd of employees began to disperse, whispering excitedly among themselves. The spectacle was over. The lobby was suddenly quiet, leaving just Stetson and Flora standing in the echoing space. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a strange humming awkwardness. "So, crisis management consultant, huh?" Flora said, breaking the silence. "That sounds much fancier than lady who got stuck." "It was the most accurate description I could think of," he said, his voice softer now. He looked down at her, a genuine question in his eyes. "Are you all right?" "That was a lot." "I'm fine," she said, though her heart was still doing a tap dance against her ribs. "It was like being in a fishbowl. I now have deep, unshakable empathy for all the goldfish of the world." She clutched her portfolio a little tighter. "Well, I should go. I'm an hour late for my interview." She expected him to nod, to say a polite goodbye, to be whisked away by the demands of his billion-dollar day. His part was done. He had defended her honor and secured his deal. But he didn't move. He frowned, a look of dawning realization on his face. "Your interview. Of course, for the florist position." She was stunned that he remembered. It was a tiny detail in a day of massive, earth-shattering events. "That's the one," she confirmed. "I'm sure they've already given it to someone else, but I should at least show up and apologize." "Nonsense," he said, the CEO command returning to his voice, but this time it was directed on her behalf. "You were delayed on official company business? Come with me." With you? Where? To your interview, he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He started walking toward the north elevator bank, expecting her to follow. You don't have to do that, she called after him, hurrying to catch up. Really? You have a 9-figure deal to sign and a weasel to fire. The deal can wait 5 minutes, and Garrett can stew in his own misery. It will be good for him. He didn't break his stride. Besides, I want to make sure Helen in HR understands the situation perfectly. They walked across the polished marble floor, the sound of their footsteps the only noise. Flora felt like she was in a dream. The most powerful man in the building was personally escorting her to a job interview for arranging flowers. You know, she said, trying to fill the silence, this whole floor has a very Mad Men vibe. All sleek lines and impersonal. I keep expecting to see Don Draper walk around a corner with a glass of whiskey. Stetson glanced at the modern art on the walls. I always found that show a bit cynical. I'm more of a John Wayne man myself. Flora stopped in her tracks. No way. The Duke himself? The man who could win a showdown with a single steely glare? The one and only, he said with a hint of a smile. It was about integrity, doing the right thing, even when it was hard. The belief that a man stands by his word. My father and I used to watch his movies every Sunday. My grandfather was more of a bonanza man, Flora shared. He believed any problem could be solved by the Cartwright family from a horseback. A valid philosophy, Stetson conceded gravely, though I suspect even the Cartwrights would have had trouble if the Duke rode into town. They reached the Human Resources Department. The door was a slab of frosted glass with the name Helen Gable, head of on-site aesthetics, printed on it. This is me, Flora said, her stomach doing a nervous flip. The reality of her interview came crashing back. Stetson nodded. He looked at her slightly rumpled t-shirt, and her wide, anxious eyes. You were incredible in there, Flora, he said, his voice quiet and sincere. Truly. He used her first name again. It felt different this time. Less of a slip, more of an acknowledgement. You weren't so bad yourself, Stetson, she replied, the name feeling surprisingly natural on her tongue. He knocked on the door before she could lose her nerve. A moment later, it opened to reveal a woman with a severe haircut and an expression that suggested she'd just been sucking on a lemon. Yes? Helen Gable said, her eyes flicking over Flora with disdain. You're late. The interview is at 10. My apologies, Helen, Stetson said, stepping forward slightly. Miss Daniels was with me. There was a situation that required her immediate and undivided attention. Helen Gable's lemon-sucking expression dissolved into one of pure, unadulterated shock. She stared at her ultimate boss, then at the disheveled young woman beside him, her mind clearly failing to compute the scene. Mr. Kendall, sir, she stammered. Miss Daniels here is a remarkable problem solver with a unique and effective communication style. Stetson continued smoothly, his voice leaving no room for argument. I trust you will give her application the consideration it deserves. He turned to Flora and gave her a small, encouraging smile and another one of his subtle nods. It was their signal. Go get him. He turned and walked away, leaving Flora standing in the doorway, facing a completely shell-shocked HR manager. The power of his endorsement hung in the air, a shimmering, undeniable force. Flora took a deep breath. Her day had already been a roller coaster, a space opera, and a western. Now it was time to talk about flowers. Flora stood in the doorway of Helen Gable's office, feeling like a museum piece that had suddenly been declared a national treasure. The HR manager, whose face was still stuck on a setting somewhere between awe and terror, gestured weakly toward a chair. It was less of an invitation and more of a surrender. Please, Helen squeaked, her voice several octaves higher than before. Sit. Flora sat, placing her portfolio on her lap. The sterile, beige office felt like a different planet compared to the high-drama stage of the lobby. So, Helen began, shuffling papers on her desk with trembling hands. Miss Daniels, you were consulting with Mr. Kendall. She said the words as if they were in a foreign language she didn't quite trust. Flora decided that honesty, with a slight twist of corporate jargon she'd just learned, was the best policy. There was an unforeseen logistical bottleneck in the building's primary access point, she said, trying to keep a straight face. Mr. Kendall and I collaborated to engineer a dynamic, out-of-the-box solution. Helen Gable just blinked, clearly out of her depth. Right, of course. The bottleneck. She cleared her throat and finally looked down at Flora's resume, which was sitting on top of her desk. Well, it says here you run your own shop, Petal and Stem. Why are you applying for this position? It was the first real question of the interview, and Flora felt a wave of relief. This, she knew. This was her world. Because I love a challenge, Flora said, her passion pushing aside her nerves. My shop is my heart, but it's small. I arrange flowers for weddings, for birthdays. I make people happy on a personal scale. The idea of working on a corporate scale, that's a whole different language. The challenge of creating something warm and alive in a world of glass and steel, like this building, to bring a touch of a garden into a boardroom, that's like a puzzle I desperately want to solve. She leaned forward, her earlier timidity gone. For example, the arrangements in your lobby. They're beautiful. Stargazer lilies and birds of paradise. They're dramatic, expensive. They say power. But they have no scent. They're like a silent movie. My philosophy is that flowers should engage all the senses. Imagine walking in and smelling freesia or gardenias. It wouldn't just look powerful, it would feel welcoming. It would tell clients this isn't just a place of business, it's a place of creation. She spoke for 10 minutes, her hands moving as she described the emotional resonance of color, the architectural lines of a delphinium, the subtle diplomacy of a peace lily. She didn't just talk about flowers. She told their stories. When she finished, Helen Gable was silent for a long moment, her severe expression having softened into one of genuine interest. She looked from Flora's earnest face to the portfolio in her lap. May I? Helen asked, gesturing to the portfolio. Flora handed it over. Helen slowly turned the pages, looking at the vibrant photos of Flora's work. A rustic wedding arch draped in weeping willow and wildflowers, a sharp, modern arrangement of white calla lilies for a law office, a cheerful explosion of sunflowers for a child's hospital wing. Helen closed the portfolio and placed it gently on the desk. She looked at Flora with new eyes. Your official title would be Director of Botanical Aesthetics, she said, her voice now crisp and professional. The salary is non-negotiable and the benefits package is extensive. When can you start? Flora was so stunned, it took her a moment to find her voice. She had done it. She had actually done it. She had walked in an hour late, looking like she'd been through a hurricane, and she had knocked it out of the park, and she had done it on her own terms, with her own passion. I would need to give 2 weeks' notice to my clients, she stammered, and find someone to manage my shop. 2 weeks is standard, Helen said, a small, rare smile touching her lips. Welcome to Kendall Industries, Miss Daniels. I have a feeling you're going to be a breath of fresh air around here. Flora walked out of the HR department in a daze. She had the job. She had her dream job. The whole morning felt like a fever dream, a story she would one day tell that no one would ever believe. As she crossed the lobby, she saw Sal, the security guard, who was now standing and looking at the revolving door with a suspicious frown, as if it had personally offended him. He saw her and gave her a sheepish grin. Sorry about that, miss, he said. Thing hasn't jammed in 5 years. Figures it would pick today? No worries, Sal, Flora said, still floating. It all came out smelling like a rose. The walk back to her little shop in Bucktown was 3 miles of pure, blissful decompression. The city noise, the towering buildings, the frantic energy, it all faded away as she turned onto the quiet, tree-lined street where Petal and Stem was nestled between a used bookstore and a family-run bakery. The bell above her door chimed a welcome as she entered, and she was home. The air was thick with the earthy scent of damp soil, the sweet perfume of hyacinths, and the sharp green smell of freshly cut stems. It was a chaotic, beautiful mess, her own little slice of paradise. I'm back, guys, she announced to the rows of ferns and ficus trees. And you are not going to believe the day I've had. She spent the next hour in a flurry of happy work, trimming rose thorns, misting orchids, and repotting a particularly dramatic fiddle-leaf fig. This was her sanctuary. Here, she wasn't a crisis management consultant or a damsel in the glass tower. She was just Flora, the woman who could coax a bloom from the most stubborn of plants. She was so lost in her work that she didn't hear the bell chime again. She didn't notice the figure standing uncertainly in the doorway until a deep, familiar voice spoke. I was told this is where I could find the city's foremost expert on out-of-the-box solutions. Flora spun around, a half-pruned rose still in her hand. Stetson Kendall was standing in her flower shop. It was a surreal sight. He was a titan of industry, a man of chrome and data, and he was standing in her tiny, cluttered, overwhelmingly floral world. He looked like a hawk that had accidentally flown into a hummingbird enclosure. He was magnificent, but he didn't quite fit. "Mr. Kendall," she said, her heart giving a surprisingly hard thump. "What are you doing here? Did the deal fall through? Did you decide to invest in tulips instead?" "The deal is signed, sealed, and delivered," he said, a faint smile on his lips. He stepped further into the shop, his expensive leather shoes navigating carefully around a fallen pile of eucalyptus leaves. "And no, I'm not diversifying into agriculture just yet. I'm here as a client." "A client?" she asked, genuinely confused. "I owe the Mitsui delegation a gift," he explained. "A thank you for their patience and a commemoration of our new partnership. After your lecture in the lobby, it seemed profoundly unimaginative to send them a generic fruit basket." "Good call," Flora approved. "A fruit basket says, I had my assistant handle this. Flowers, chosen correctly, say, I thought about this." "Precisely," he agreed. "And since you are the newly appointed director of botanical aesthetics for my company, I thought I'd start delegating." The teasing glint was back in his eyes. They were slipping back into their banter, and it felt as comfortable as a favorite old sweater. "My official duties don't start for 2 weeks," she retorted, playing along. "Right now, you're speaking to the proprietor of Petal and Stem, and my consulting fees are steep." "I'm sure I can afford them," he said, his gaze sweeping around the shop. He seemed genuinely fascinated by the riot of color and life. "This is quite a place." "It's organized chaos," Flora said proudly. "Like my brain. Of all the flower shops in all the towns in all the world, I walk into hers," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Flora's breath caught. Was that a Casablanca reference? He met her eyes, a look of mild surprise on his face. "You got it. I'm impressed." "Are you kidding? That's only one of the greatest movies of all time," she said, her voice full of reverence. "Humphrey Bogart, Ingrid Bergman will always have Paris. It's cinematic perfection." "My mother's favorite," he said, a soft, nostalgic look crossing his features. "She would have liked this place. She always said my world was mostly gray." It was another glimpse behind the curtain, a moment of startling vulnerability. He saw his world as gray. Flora looked around her shop, at the fiery reds, the sunny yellows, the deep purples. Her world was anything but. "Well," she said gently, "we can fix that. What kind of message do you want to send to the investors?" "Something that conveys gratitude, respect, and the promise of a strong, enduring partnership," he said, his focus shifting back to the task at hand. "Okay, that's a language I speak," Flora said, moving behind her counter. "We need something with structure, but also with life. Something that honors their culture without being a cliché." She began pulling stems from various buckets. No red roses. Too romantic, no white lilies. In some Asian cultures, they're associated with funerals. "Good to know," he said, watching her with rapt attention. "I was a hair's breadth from causing a major international incident." "See, you need me," she teased. She laid a long, elegant stalk of bamboo on the counter. "We start with this, for strength and flexibility." She added a spray of delicate white orchids, for nobility and refinement. She worked quickly, her hands moving with an innate grace. She explained each choice. Willow branches for tenacity, yellow chrysanthemums, a symbol of the sun and truth in Japan, a few sprigs of heather for good fortune. Stetson watched, utterly captivated. He had spent his life watching people manipulate numbers and code. He had never seen someone create meaning out of leaves and petals. "Here," she said, holding out a particularly beautiful branch of pink camellias. "You add this one." "Me?" he asked, looking startled. "I'll probably break it." "You can command a global empire from a revolving door. I think you can handle a flower," she said, her eyes smiling. He reached for it, his large, capable hand surprisingly gentle. As he took it, his fingers brushed against hers. A tiny, unexpected spark of electricity jumped between them. It was nothing, a fleeting moment of static, but it made Flora's breath hitch. She saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes, too. He carefully placed the camellia into the arrangement. "What's this one for?" he asked, his voice a little rougher than before. Camellias symbolize gratitude, she said softly, her eyes holding his, and admiration. The air in the small shop was suddenly thick with unspoken things. The scents of the flowers, the quiet hum of the city outside, the memory of their shared crisis. It was all swirling around them. He cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "It's perfect," he said, looking at the finished arrangement. It was stunning, a piece of living art that told a story. "How much do I owe you?" "Don't worry about it," she said, waving a hand. "Consider it a signing bonus, or a thank you for the most memorable job interview of my life." "I insist," he said, pulling out a wallet that probably had its own security detail. "Absolutely not," she countered, folding her arms. "My shop, my rules, this one's on the house for Butch." His lips curved into that genuinely warm smile again, the one that made him look less like a titan and more like a man. "In that case, thank you, Sundance." He picked up the arrangement carefully. "I'll have a courier take care of the rest. Arthur will be thrilled he doesn't have to figure out how to gift wrap a plant." He paused at the door. "I'll see you in 2 weeks, Director of Botanical Aesthetics." "I'll be there, Mr. Kendall," she said. "Stetson," he corrected her gently. And then he was gone, the bell above the door chiming his exit. Flora stood alone in her quiet, fragrant shop, her heart beating a wild, unruly rhythm. She touched the spot on her hand where his fingers had brushed hers. It still felt warm. She had a new job, a new boss, and a whole new set of problems, she was sure. But as she looked around at the beautiful, chaotic, colorful world she had built for herself, she couldn't help but feel a thrill of anticipation. A world of gray, he had said. Maybe, just maybe, she was the person who was meant to bring him some color. 2 weeks later, Flora Daniels stood once again in the gleaming lobby of Kendall Industries Tower, though this time under vastly different circumstances. She wasn't a desperate interviewee clutching a portfolio. She was the new director of Botanical Aesthetics, clutching a cardboard box filled with the essentials for corporate survival. A quirky coffee mug shaped like a mushroom, a well-thumbed copy of The Language of Flowers, a small, resilient succulent she'd named Spike, and a framed photo of her grinning grandfather leaning against his prize-winning pumpkin. She wore a cheerful, knee-length dress patterned with tiny, colorful wildflowers. It was her version of a power suit. Judging by the sea of navy, black, and charcoal gray suits flowing around her, she was a poppy in a field of granite. A few people gave her curious glances, their expressions a mix of confusion and, was that admiration? The story of the revolving door presentation she'd learned had become the stuff of corporate legend. She was the flower whisperer, the door jam duchess. It was both embarrassing and, she had to admit, a little bit thrilling. She took the elevator. A normal, spacious, non-trapping one, thank goodness, up to the 45th floor. Her new office was exactly what she expected. Clean, efficient, and completely devoid of personality. It was a blank canvas of beige walls, a gray desk, and a window with a breathtaking, if impersonal, view of the city. "Okay, Spike," she said, placing the succulent on the corner of the desk. "Time to liven this place up." A light knock on her open door made her jump. A young man with bright, curious eyes and a slightly rumpled tie stood there, holding a tablet. "Miss Daniels, I'm Simon. I guess I'm your logistical liaison from the events department." He practically vibrated with nervous energy. "It's a real honor, ma'am. What you did, what you and Mr. Kendall did, we're all still talking about it. My grandpa would have loved it. He was a huge fan of the underdog." Flora couldn't help but smile. "Please call me Flora, and trust me, it was much less glamorous than it sounds." "I don't know," Simon said, his eyes wide. "Facing down the Mitsui delegation from a revolving door? That's like something out of a James Bond movie. A very strange, stationary James Bond movie. Well, this Bond girl's first mission is figuring out where the coffee machine is." Flora laughed. "I can show you," Simon said eagerly, "right after I give you this." He handed her the tablet. "It's from Helen Gable, your first official assignment." Flora took the tablet. On the screen was a single, ominous file folder labeled KI Foundation Gala Annual. "Whoa," she breathed. "They're throwing me right into the deep end, aren't they?" "The gala is the biggest event of the year," Simon explained. "It's Mr. Kendall's personal passion project. It raises millions for children's literacy programs. Everything has to be perfect. The food, the music, the lighting, and," he gestured around them, the botanical aesthetics. No pressure then, Flora said, her stomach doing a little flip-flop. This was it, her chance to prove herself. The preliminary budget is already loaded, Simon continued, but you'll have to get final approval from him. Simon's face clouded over as Garrett Stone sauntered past her office door, not even bothering to look in. Let me guess, Flora said, her good mood dimming slightly. Mr. Stone holds the purse strings. He's the head of the gala committee, Simon confirmed in a whisper. He signs off on every line item. He's a real stickler for details. Flora understood what stickler for details was code for. The memory of Garrett's sneering face in the lobby was still fresh. This was not going to be easy. As if summoned, Garrett appeared in her doorway, leaning against the frame with a look of bored superiority. "Ah, the new director," he said, his eyes scanning her colorful dress with faint distaste. "Settling in? I trust you've received the gala briefing." "I have," Flora said, her voice even. "It looks like a wonderful event." "It's the crown jewel of our philanthropic efforts," Garrett said. "As such, it has a certain standard to maintain, a level of sophistication. I'll need your preliminary design concept and budget on my desk by Friday." "It's Wednesday, Garrett," Flora pointed out, "and I don't even have the theme yet." "The theme is irrelevant to the preliminary budget," he said dismissively. "Just base it on last year's numbers. We had white orchids. Lots of them. Very clean, very classic. You can't go wrong with white orchids." He was already trying to railroad her, to box her into his own unimaginative vision. He wasn't interested in her expertise. He was interested in her compliance. "I prefer to build a concept from the theme up, not the budget down," Flora said calmly. "It ensures a more cohesive and impactful experience." "Impactful?" Garrett chuckled. "They're flowers, sweetheart. They just need to look expensive. Friday, my desk." "Don't be late." He pushed off the doorframe and was gone, leaving a trail of smug cologne in his wake. Flora let out a long, frustrated breath. "Okay," she said to Simon, who looked at her with sympathy. "First order of business, what is the theme?" Simon's face fell. "Ah, that's the thing. It's a secret." "A secret?" Flora asked, baffled. "How am I supposed to design anything if I don't know the theme?" "Mr. Kendall chooses it himself every year," Simon explained. "It's always something deeply personal to him. He usually reveals it to the committee a month before the event, but he hasn't yet. No one knows what it is." Flora's heart sank. She was trapped. She couldn't create a budget without a concept. She couldn't create a concept without a theme, and the one person who knew the theme was the one person she was desperately trying to maintain a professional distance from. Stetson Kendall. She researched last year's gala. Garrett was right, white orchids. Thousands of them. It was elegant, cold, and utterly soulless. It was, she realized, a perfect floral representation of the man Stetson used to be. But he wasn't that man anymore, was he? The man who quoted Butch Cassidy and had a soft spot for old westerns wouldn't choose white orchids again. By Thursday afternoon, she knew she had no choice. She couldn't go to Garrett with a recycled idea. She had to go to the source. She put on a brave face and marched up to the 80th floor. The executive suite was a world unto itself. The air was hushed, the carpets were plush, and the view was so vast, it felt like you were flying. Presiding over it all from a desk that looked like a modernist sculpture was a woman with silver hair pulled into a flawless chignon and an expression of serene, unshakable control. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice calm and clear, but with an underlying strength that suggested she could stop a charging rhino with a single, well-chosen word. "Hi," Flora said, feeling her confidence waver. "I'm Flora Daniels. I'm the new director of Botanical Aesthetics. I need to speak with Mr. Kendall." The woman's perfectly tweezed eyebrow rose a fraction of an inch. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but it's about the Foundation Gala. It's quite urgent." "I am Beatrice Vance, Mr. Kendall's executive assistant," the woman said. "All matters concerning the gala can be directed to me or to Mr. Stone." "I understand," Flora said, "but this is about the theme, and I was told Mr. Kendall is the only one who knows it." Beatrice's expression didn't change, but her eyes assessed Flora with a new level of scrutiny. "I see." She looked down at her screen, her fingers tapping silently on her keyboard. Flora could feel her entire professional life being scanned and analyzed. "You're the one from the door," Beatrice stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "That's me," Flora confirmed with a weak smile. Beatrice was silent for another long moment. Then she pressed a button on her console. "Mr. Kendall, Miss Daniels is here to see you regarding the gala theme." There was a pause. "Yes, sir, I'll send her in." She looked up at Flora. "He'll see you." It felt less like permission and more like a pronouncement. Flora's heart hammered as she walked toward the large double doors of Stetson's office. She took a deep breath and pushed them open. The office was vast. One entire wall was a floor-to-ceiling window showcasing the city below. The furniture was sleek, minimalist, and, as his mother had apparently observed, overwhelmingly gray. Stetson was standing by the window looking out, but he turned as she entered. He was wearing a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, and for a moment he wasn't her boss. He was the man from the flower shop. "Flora," he said, his voice warm, "I was wondering when you'd make it up here." "I was trying not to," she admitted, stepping into the room. "I didn't want to bother you. But Garrett Stone is demanding a budget, and your gatekeeper out there is more formidable than the entire 7th Cavalry." A genuine laugh escaped him. "Beatrice is my greatest asset. She's been with my family since before I was born. If she let you through, it means you passed some kind of mysterious, unspoken test." He gestured to a chair. "Please." She sat down, and he took the seat behind his enormous desk. The desk was a physical barrier between them, a reminder of their new reality. Boss and employee. "The gala theme," he said, his expression becoming more serious. "Yes, I apologize for the secrecy. It's just, this year is different." He hesitated, looking out the window for a moment before meeting her eyes. "My mother passed away 6 months ago," he said quietly. "The Literacy Foundation was her legacy. This will be the first gala without her. I wanted the theme to be a tribute to her. I just couldn't bring myself to talk about it with the committee." The confession was so raw and unexpected, it knocked the air out of Flora. The gray in his world suddenly made a lot more sense. It wasn't a design choice, it was grief. "Stetson, I'm so sorry," she said, her heart aching for him. "Thank you," he said, giving a small, sad smile. "She would have loved what you did in the lobby, the way you stood up to me. She was never afraid to tell me when I was being boring, either." They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, a shared understanding passing between them. "The theme?" he said, pulling himself back to the present. "It's an English garden at midnight. Her favorite place in the world was the garden at our family home, at night. She said that's when the real magic happened." "White flowers that seem to glow in the moonlight," Flora said, her mind already racing. "Night-blooming jasmine, moonflower, tuberose for their scent. It's a beautiful theme, Stetson, a perfect tribute." "I knew you'd understand," he said, and the relief in his voice was palpable. He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a thick, leather-bound book. It was old, the corners soft with age. "I want you to have this," he said, pushing it across the desk toward her. Flora looked at it. It was a journal, filled with elegant, faded handwriting and delicate, hand-drawn sketches of plants and flowers. "It was my mother's gardening journal," he explained. "Her notes, her plans, her thoughts on what bloomed where. I thought it might help you." Flora reached out and touched the worn leather cover. This wasn't a corporate file, it was a piece of his history, a piece of his heart. It was the most profound gesture of trust he could have possibly made. This was more valuable than any 9-figure deal. I don't know what to say," she whispered, overwhelmed. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "Just make it beautiful. Make it something she would have loved." She looked up at him, the heavy journal in her hands. The desk between them didn't feel like a barrier anymore. It felt like a bridge. He had not only given her a theme, he had given her the story behind it. He had let her into his world of gray and handed her the tools to bring the color back. "I will," she promised, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll make it magical." He nodded, a look of immense gratitude on his face. "There's one more thing," he said, a faint, teasing light returning to his eyes. "My mother was a huge fan of classic movie musicals. She always said a great party, like a great musical, needs a show-stopping number." He leaned forward. "She adored Audrey Hepburn, especially My Fair Lady." Flora's heart leaped. "The flower girl who becomes a queen," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "The Ascot scene, the embassy ball." "Exactly," he said, his own smile mirroring hers. "So director of Botanical Aesthetics, No pressure, but I'm expecting a showstopper. She stood up, clutching the journal to her chest as it were a precious treasure. You'll get it, Mr. Kendall, she said, her confidence restored, her mission clear. Stetson, he corrected her once more, his voice a low, warm murmur. Stetson, she repeated. I won't let you down. As she walked out of his office, past a faintly smiling Beatrice, Flora felt a shift deep within her. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a promise. She was no longer just arranging flowers for a gala. She was telling a love story, a son's love for his mother. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting a new one of her own. Flora spent the next 48 hours living in two worlds. By day, she navigated the pristine, quiet corridors of Kendall Industries, learning the intricate dance of corporate life. She discovered where the good coffee was, the machine on the 52nd floor, a well-guarded secret, learned the names of the security staff, Sal was now her firm ally, and figured out how to use the bafflingly complex phone system. But by night, she retreated into the world of Eleanor Kendall. Stetson's mother's journal was not just a book. It was a time capsule. Flora would sit in her small apartment, a cup of chamomile tea steaming beside her, and turn the delicate, time-softened pages. Eleanor's handwriting was a beautiful, looping script full of personality. She didn't just write about plants, she wrote to them. My dear Mrs. Harding, one entry read, next to a sketch of a climbing rose. You are being particularly stubborn this year. The aphids think you are a grand hotel, but we shall show them the error of their ways. Flora found herself laughing out loud, feeling an incredible kinship with this woman she'd never met. Eleanor was witty, passionate, and deeply connected to the earth. She wrote about how the scent of lavender reminded her of her honeymoon in Provence, and how the resilient little pansies that pushed through the last winter snow always reminded her of her son's stubborn chin when he was a boy. The journal was filled with pressed flowers, their colors faded to gentle ghosts of what they once were. It was a treasure map of a life well lived. As Flora read, her vision for the gala began to take shape. It wouldn't just be a room filled with flowers. It would be an experience, a walk through Eleanor Kendall's memories. She sketched out a plan. Different sections of the grand ballroom would represent different parts of the garden. A moonlight terrace with glowing white florals, a whispering walkway lined with fragrant herbs, and at the center, a stunning recreation of Eleanor's favorite weeping willow, its branches dripping with tiny star-like lights. It was ambitious, it was magical, and, as she discovered when she ran the preliminary numbers, it was going to be expensive. Armed with her sketches, the journal, and a healthy dose of courage, she scheduled the budget meeting with Garrett Stone. She walked into the conference room on Friday morning feeling prepared. She had her concept, her numbers, and the emotional weight of a beautiful legacy behind her. Garrett was already there, tapping impatiently on his phone. Daniels, he said without looking up. You have 10 minutes. Good morning to you too, Garrett, Flora said, refusing to be intimidated. She laid her sketches out on the polished mahogany table. I have the preliminary concept for the gala. The theme, An English Garden at Midnight, is a tribute to the late Eleanor Kendall. I'm aware of the theme, he cut her off, finally pocketing his phone. Just show me the budget. Flora slid the spreadsheet across the table. Garrett glanced at the bottom line, and a slow, crocodile-like smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting for his opponent to make a mistake. You cannot be serious, he scoffed. This is 30% over last year's budget? A weeping willow? Star-like lights? What is this, a high school play? It's a multi-sensory experience designed to honor the founder of the foundation, Flora countered, her voice steady. It will create a lasting emotional impact on the donors, encouraging greater generosity. What encourages generosity, sweetheart, is a strong stock market and an open bar, he sneered. Not sentimental nonsense about whispering walkways. This budget is preposterous, it's fiscally irresponsible. The funds are for a children's literacy foundation, Flora argued. Celebrating it with a theme that feels like it's straight out of a storybook seems not only appropriate but powerful. Cute. Very poetic, he said, taking a red pen and drawing a thick, brutal line through her total. He scribbled a new number, the one from last year's Orchid Fest, and pushed the paper back to her. This is your budget. Make it work. White orchids. Lots of them. It's clean, it's classic, and it doesn't involve turning the ballroom into a forest. My decision is final. Flora stared at the red line. It felt like a slap in the face. He hadn't even listened. He hadn't even looked at her sketches. He had dismissed her, and Eleanor, without a second thought. "This isn't just about the budget, is it, Garrett?" she said, her voice quiet. "It's about fiscal prudence," he said, standing up. "Something a woman who plays with dirt all day wouldn't understand. The meeting is over." Flora was left alone in the conference room, the scent of Garrett's smug victory hanging in the air. She felt a hot surge of anger, followed by a cold wave of despair. He had all the power. He was the head of the committee. His decision was final. She could go back to her office and design the most boring, soulless orchid display in history, or she could fight. She thought of her grandfather and his prize-winning pumpkins. He never won by growing the smallest, most budget-friendly pumpkin. He won by giving it the best soil, the most sun, the most care. He won by believing in its potential. She packed up her things, her resolve hardening. This wasn't over. She went to Simon first, hoping there was some kind of appeals process. He listened to her story with a sympathetic wince. "I'm sorry, Flora," he said, his voice low. "Garrett has complete autonomy over the gala budget. It's in the committee charter. He'd love for you to go over his head. It would make you look difficult and emotional. He'd use it against you. So I'm just supposed to roll over and let him pave paradise to put up a parking lot of orchids?" She fumed, paraphrasing the old Joni Mitchell song. Simon looked helpless. "I'm afraid so. Unless what? Unless the CEO invokes an executive override," he said. "But that's like the nuclear option. It's never happened. It would be a massive public slapdown to a senior executive. Mr. Kendall would never do that over flowers." But it wasn't just about flowers, was it? It was about his mother. Flora knew what she had to do. It was risky. It might get her fired. It would certainly make her a permanent enemy of Garrett Stone. But she looked down at the leather-bound journal in her bag. She had made a promise. She took the elevator back to the 80th floor. Beatrice Vance looked up as she approached, her expression as unreadable as ever. "He's in a meeting, Miss Daniels," Beatrice said before Flora could even speak. "I'll wait," Flora said, her voice firm. She sat in one of the sleek gray chairs opposite Beatrice's desk. She waited for an hour, then another. She watched executives come and go. She watched the sun track across the sky through the enormous windows. Through it all, she clutched the journal in her lap. It was her shield and her sword. Finally, the door to Stetson's office opened, and a group of serious-looking men in suits filed out. Beatrice caught Stetson's eye and gave a subtle nod in Flora's direction. Stetson saw her, and a look of surprise, followed by concern, crossed his face. He dismissed the last executive and beckoned her in. "Flora, what's wrong?" he asked as she entered, the heavy doors closing behind her. "You look like you're ready to lead a rebellion." "I might be," she said, her voice trembling slightly with a mixture of anger and nerves. "It's Garrett. He rejected my proposal. He slashed the budget and demanded I fill the room with white orchids." Stetson's face hardened. He walked around his desk and leaned against it, crossing his arms. It was a more casual, more approachable stance. He was inviting a conversation, not a report. "Tell me everything," he said. She did. She told him about Garrett's condescending attitude, his refusal to even look at her concept. She told him about the red line he'd drawn through her budget, a slash that felt personal. As she spoke, she opened his mother's journal on his desk, turning to a page with a pressed, perfect moonflower. "He called her vision sentimental nonsense," Flora said, her voice thick with outrage. "He wants to honor this vibrant, funny, incredible woman with a room that has all the soul of a hospital waiting room. Stetson, this isn't a budget dispute. This is an insult to her memory." She was standing close to him now, their shared focus on the open journal. He reached out and gently touched the brittle, paper-thin flower on the page. "She called these her stars on earth," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. She'd sit on the porch for hours, waiting for them to open at dusk. It was like watching a magic trick in slow motion. He looked up from the journal, his blue eyes blazing with a cold fire Flora hadn't seen since the revolving door. "He had this journal," Stetson said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I gave it to the committee 2 months ago. I told them to read it to understand her. He had it, and he still did that. He doesn't see it, Flora said. He just sees numbers on a spreadsheet. But this gala, it's a story. And you asked me to tell it. I can't do that with his budget, but I also can't go over his head without starting a war. Then we'll give him a war, Stetson said, his decision made. He straightened up, walked around his desk, and sat down. He wasn't leaning anymore. He was the CEO again, but this time he was her CEO, her ally. He hit the button on his intercom. Beatrice, get Garrett Stone on the line, now. A moment later, Garrett's tinny voice came through the speaker. Yes, Mr. Kendall? Garrett, Stetson said, his voice deceptively calm. I'm looking at the revised budget for the Foundation Gala, the one you just approved. Yes, sir, Garrett said, a hint of pride in his voice. Just ensuring we stay fiscally responsible. My mother, Stetson said, his voice dropping an octave, once threw out an entire set of priceless china because she said it had no joy. She believed that things of beauty were an investment in the human spirit, not a liability on a balance sheet. That foundation was her joy, Garrett. Do you understand? Sir, with all due respect. The budget that Ms. Daniels submitted is not a request. Stetson cut him off, his voice like steel. It is the new baseline. You will approve it in its entirety. You will provide Ms. Daniels with every resource she requires, and you will not interfere with her creative vision in any way. If I hear so much as a whisper that you have been anything less than completely supportive, you and I will be having a very different conversation about your future at this company. Is that clear? The silence from the speaker was deafening. Flora could practically hear Garrett's jaw hitting the floor. Yes, Mr. Kendall, Garrett finally choked out. Crystal clear. Good, Stetson said, and cut the line. He looked up at Flora, the hard glint in his eyes softening. I believe you have a budget to manage, Director. The relief that flooded through Flora was so immense, she felt lightheaded. Thank you, she whispered. You have no idea what that means. I made you a promise, he said simply. And I don't break my promises. He looked at the journal, still open on his desk. Now, show me this weeping willow. I want to see the magic trick. Flora's heart swelled. She pulled up a chair and sat down next to him, not opposite him, side by side. She opened her portfolio, and for the next hour, they weren't boss and employee. They were co-conspirators, partners. She walked him through every detail of her vision, and he listened, not as a CEO but as a son, his eyes alight with the memory of his mother, and the vision of the tribute she so richly deserved. The gray in his office didn't seem so gray anymore. It was starting to feel like the quiet, peaceful twilight, just before the stars on Earth came out. The weeks leading up to the gala became a whirlwind of organized chaos, a beautiful storm of color, texture, and scent. Flora's once pristine office was transformed into a veritable jungle. Sketches and fabric swatches were pinned to the walls, buckets of exotic greenery lined the floor, and the air hummed with the sweet, heady perfume of 100 different test blooms. She had moved a part of Petal and Stem into the heart of Kendall Industries, and to her surprise, the sterile corporate building seemed to breathe a little deeper, a little happier. Her partnership with Stetson evolved in a way she never could have predicted. It started with professional check-ins. He would stop by her office at the end of the day, ostensibly to review progress. But the meetings quickly became less about spreadsheets and more about stories. He would pick up a strange-looking thistle or a velvety rose and ask about its origin, and Flora would find herself talking for 20 minutes about Scottish moors or ancient Persian gardens. He was a surprisingly good listener, absorbing every detail with the same intensity he applied to market analytics. He learned the difference between a dahlia and a zinnia. He learned that baby's breath was considered terribly old-fashioned, a floral faux pas on par with wearing white after Labor Day. And he learned that the night-blooming Sirius, a cactus flower, blooms only once a year, for a single night, a fact that seemed to captivate him completely. One night, he mused, gently touching a picture of the ethereal white flower in one of Flora's botany books. All that effort, all that waiting, for one perfect moment. Some moments are worth the wait, Flora said softly, and the look that passed between them was about more than just flowers. One evening, she was wrestling with a complex wiring diagram for the lights on the weeping willow centerpiece. The engineering team had sent her a blueprint that looked like the schematics for a nuclear submarine. She was frowning at it, completely lost, when Stetson appeared in her doorway. "A logistical bottleneck?" he asked, a teasing smile playing on his lips. "You have no idea," she groaned, running a hand through her hair. "I feel like I'm trying to read ancient hieroglyphics. I just want to make the branches twinkle, not launch them into orbit." He came over and looked at the diagram over her shoulder. She was acutely aware of his closeness, the clean, crisp scent of his shirt, the warmth radiating from him. "I think I can help with this," he said, his voice a low rumble near her ear. He took a pen from her desk and with a few swift, elegant strokes simplified the entire diagram. He created a new, more efficient circuit path, pointing out redundant connections and power flow inefficiencies. Flora stared at the revised drawing, her jaw slightly slack. "How did you do that?" "My first love wasn't business," he admitted, a nostalgic look in his eyes. "It was engineering. I used to build radios from scratch in my garage. My mother called it my tinkering phase. She bought me my first soldering iron for my 12th birthday. It was another piece of his puzzle. Another glimpse of the boy who existed long before the billionaire. The boy who loved to build things. "You're a man of many talents, Stetson Kendall," she said, her voice full of genuine admiration. "I have my moments," he said, his eyes lingering on hers. "But I'm beginning to think my greatest talent is knowing when to delegate to the real expert." The true turning point, however, came on a Saturday, a week before the gala. Flora was at her main supplier, a massive, sprawling nursery greenhouse on the outskirts of the city. She was hand-selecting the hundreds of potted jasmine vines that would form the whispering walkway, and she was hopelessly behind schedule. Her part-time help had called in sick. She was hot, sweaty, covered in dirt, and trying to load a heavy cart when a sleek, black car she recognized pulled up the gravel path. Stetson got out. He had traded his bespoke suit for a simple, dark gray polo shirt and tailored jeans. He looked less like a CEO and more like a man on his day off, but he still seemed out of place among the towering shelves of petunias and pallets of potting soil. "Lost?" she asked, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek with the back of her hand. "Beatrice told me you were short-handed," he said, looking at the mountain of work still ahead of her. "She has an uncanny ability to know everything. I was on my way back from the club. Thought you might need an extra pair of hands." Flora stared at him. "You came to a nursery to help me haul plants?" "I believe my exact words were, 'I have a good coach,'" he said, a ghost of his revolving door smile appearing. "So, coach, what's the play?" She was so flabbergasted she could only point. "Those jasmine vines, they need to be loaded onto the truck. All of them." He didn't hesitate. He rolled up the sleeves of his polo shirt, revealing strong, capable forearms, and picked up a heavy terracotta pot as if it weighed nothing. For the next 3 hours, they worked side by side in the warm, humid air of the greenhouse. They didn't talk much. They just worked, falling into a comfortable, efficient rhythm. He would lift, she would direct, and together they conquered the jungle. He wasn't clumsy or awkward as she might have expected. He was methodical, efficient, and surprisingly strong. He got dirt on his expensive jeans and a smudge of pollen on his nose, and he didn't complain once. He just worked. When the last vine was loaded, they collapsed onto a dusty wooden bench, exhausted and filthy, sharing a bottle of water. "You know," Flora said, catching her breath, "this probably wasn't what you had in mind when you hired a director of botanical aesthetics." "Honestly," he said, taking a long drink of water, "this is the most real work I've done in years. Most of my day is spent in abstract concepts and hypothetical futures. This is real." He looked at his hands, which were smudged with soil. "It feels good." "It's called grounding," she said softly. "It's good for the soul." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the gentle hiss of the sprinklers and the distant hum of the city. "My mother would have loved this," he said quietly, looking around the greenhouse. "She would have dragged my father out here every weekend. He'd complain about the dirt, but he'd do it because it made her happy." "He sounds like a good man," Flora said. "He was," Stetson replied. "He was a lot like her garden. Seemed tough and thorny on the outside, but underneath he was all heart." It was the first time he had mentioned his father in the past tense. Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. He wasn't just grieving his mother, he was navigating the world alone, carrying the weight of two legacies. The quiet intimacy of the moment was broken by the crunch of gravel. Garrett Stone was walking toward them. He was dressed in immaculate tennis whites, a country club sweater draped casually over his shoulders. He looked at Stetson, then at Flora, then at their dirt-stained clothes, and his lip curled in a barely concealed sneer. "Stetson," he said, his voice dripping with false concern, "I've been trying to reach you. There's an issue with the quarterly reports. I didn't realize you were gardening." "I was assisting a member of my team with a critical project, Garrett," Stetson said, his voice perfectly level but with an underlying edge of steel. "It's called leadership. You should try it sometime." Garrett's face tightened. His eyes flicked to Flora. "Of course, I just hope this project isn't distracting from the bigger picture. The board is getting antsy about the gala's ROI. The return on this investment will be measured in the lives we change, not the pennies we pinch," Stetson said dismissively. "Send me the report. I'll look at it on Monday. We're finished here." It was a clear dismissal. Garrett stared for a second longer, a look of pure venom in his eyes, before giving a stiff nod and retreating to his own luxury car. "I'm sorry," Flora said, once he was gone. "I feel like I'm causing you trouble." "You're not the trouble, Flora," Stetson said, his gaze following Garrett's car. "You're the solution. He just doesn't see it yet." He stood up and offered her a hand. "Come on, let me buy you lunch. I think we've earned it." She took his hand. His grip was warm and strong, his palm calloused in a way that surprised her. It wasn't the hand of a man who only pushed papers. As he helped her up, he didn't let go right away. "There's a little place not far from here," he said, his voice a little lower. "An old diner. They make a fantastic patty melt. It was my dad's favorite. What do you say? A tribute to the good old days." Flora looked at their intertwined hands, then up at his face. The sun, filtering through the greenhouse roof, caught the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. He was covered in dirt, and he had never looked more handsome. "I say yes," she said, her heart doing a slow, warm tumble in her chest. "Lead the way, Duke." He smiled, a real, unguarded smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "All right, Sundance? Giddy up." The diner was a perfect slice of Americana, a time capsule from an era of chrome, red vinyl, and jukeboxes that actually played records. It was called the Starlight, and its neon sign flickered with a friendly, buzzing welcome. The air inside smelled of sizzling bacon, strong coffee, and decades of shared stories. As Stetson held the door open for Flora, she felt like she was stepping into a Norman Rockwell painting. They slid into a booth by the window. The vinyl was cracked in a few places, and the tabletop had the faint, overlapping rings of 1,000 coffee cups. It was real. It was lived in. It was the absolute antithesis of Stetson's sleek, minimalist office. And yet, he looked completely at home. A waitress with a beehive hairdo that defied gravity and a name tag that read Flo ambled over. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," she said, her voice a warm, gravelly rasp. "Stetson Kendall, I haven't seen you in here since your dad. Well, in a long time." "Flo," Stetson said, his voice filled with a genuine warmth Flora had never heard before. "It's good to see you. You haven't aged a day." "Liar," she cackled, tapping his arm with her order pad. "But I'll take it. The usual? 2 patty melts, extra onions, and a chocolate malt to share?" "You remembered," he said, looking genuinely touched. He glanced at Flora. "Is that okay? Are you kidding?" "That sounds like heaven on a plate," Flora said. "You've got good taste, honey," Flo said, giving Flora an approving wink. "I'll have it right out for you." She shuffled away, calling out the order to a cook in the back. "The usual?" Flora asked, raising an eyebrow. "I wouldn't have pegged you for a patty melt kind of guy." "My dad and I used to come here every Saturday after my Little League games," he explained, a distant, fond look in his eyes. "Win or lose, we'd get patty melts." He said there was no problem in the world so big it couldn't be improved by melted cheese and grilled onions. "He sounds like my kind of philosopher," Flora said with a smile. "My grandpa's go-to was always a root beer float. He called it liquid optimism." They fell into an easy conversation, sharing stories about their childhoods. She told him about growing up above the flower shop, which her grandparents had started. She described learning the names of flowers before she learned her alphabet, and how she used to make potions out of mud and fallen petals in the backyard. He, in turn, told her about a childhood that was privileged, but often lonely. He talked about his mother's garden being his real refuge, a place where he didn't have to be the prodigy or the heir, just a boy digging for worms. He confessed that his first business venture, at age 9, was trying to sell his mother's prized roses back to her for a profit. "She bought every one," he said, a wry smile on his face. "Then she sat me down and gave me a long, serious lecture on the concepts of overhead and intellectual property. It was the most gentle but thorough business lesson of my life." Flora laughed, picturing a small, stubborn Stetson getting a masterclass in commerce from his elegant mother. They were two people from completely different worlds, yet they had found this surprising common ground, a deep, abiding love for the people who had raised them, and the simple, earthy things that brought them joy. Their food arrived, a glorious, greasy feast. The patty melts were perfect, and the chocolate malt was thick enough to hold a spoon upright. As they shared it, their hands brushed, and this time, the spark wasn't a surprise. It was a low, pleasant hum of awareness that lingered between them. "You know," Stetson said, looking at her over the rim of the malt glass, "when I first saw you in the revolving door, I thought you were a chaos agent." "A what?" she asked, laughing. "A chaos agent," he repeated. "Someone who had been sent by the universe to disrupt my perfectly ordered, perfectly controlled life. You were quirky and sarcastic, and you kept making these bizarrely accurate old TV show references." "Hey, there's a lot of wisdom in the Twilight Zone," she defended playfully. "I'm beginning to see that," he admitted. "I spent my whole life building walls, Flora. Schedules, protocols, firewalls, all designed to keep the unpredictable at bay. And then you came along and didn't even bother to use the door. You just blew right through the wall." His voice was low and serious, and his gaze was so intense it made her feel like she was the only person in the world. "I thought you were a disruption," he continued. "But I was wrong. You're not chaos. You're clarity. You cut through all the noise. You remind me of what's actually real." Flora's heart felt like it was doing a slow, warm somersault. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. No one had ever seen her like that before. Before she could respond, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, and the soft, open expression on his face vanished, replaced by a thunderous scowl. "What is it?" she asked, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "It's Garrett," he said, his voice a low growl. "He just sent a company-wide memo. Subject line, Gala Budget Update and Vendor Scrutiny Initiative." "Vendor scrutiny?" Flora asked, confused. "It's a corporate dog whistle," Stetson said, his eyes scanning the email. "He's announcing that due to the significantly expanded and unconventional budget for the gala, he is launching a top-to-bottom review of all new vendors to ensure compliance with Kendall Industries' rigorous fiscal standards. He's targeting you, Flora." The implications hit her like a physical blow. "He's gonna audit my shop? My little shop? He's gonna try to drown you in paperwork," Stetson said, his jaw tight with fury. "He'll demand years of tax records, supplier invoices, insurance certificates. He's looking for a loophole, a single misplaced decimal point, anything he can use to disqualify you as a vendor. He'll claim you're not financially robust enough to handle a project of this scale. He's trying to cut you off at the knees." The joy of the last few hours evaporated, replaced by a cold, sickening fear. Petal and Stem was her life, but it was a small business. Her bookkeeping was honest, but it was done on her laptop at her kitchen table, not by a team of accountants. She was a florist, not a CFO. Garrett would tear her apart. "He can't do that," she whispered, her voice small. "He can," Stetson said grimly. "He's technically within his rights as head of the committee. It's a snake's move, but it's technically legal." Flora felt the walls closing in. This was what Garrett had meant. "Run along now, before you get hurt." She had been so focused on the creative vision, she had forgotten she was in a game with a man who didn't play fair. I can't fight that," she said, the fight draining out of her. "I don't have the resources." Stetson reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His touch was warm and steady, an anchor in her sudden storm. "You don't have to fight it," he said, his voice low and fierce. "I will." He stood up, dropping a few bills on the table that could have probably bought the entire diner. "Come on," he said, his hand still holding hers, pulling her gently to her feet. We're going back to the office." "What are you going to do?" she asked as he led her out into the bright afternoon sun. "Something I should have done a long time ago," he said, his eyes like blue steel. They drove back to the tower in a tense silence. When they reached the 80th floor, Stetson didn't even slow down. He strode through the executive suite with Flora in tow, his hand still firmly holding hers. He didn't stop at Beatrice's desk. He didn't stop at his office. He walked directly into the main executive boardroom. It was empty, save for one person. Garrett Stone was at the head of the long, polished table, looking at a report, a smug smile on his face. He looked up as they entered, his smile faltering as he saw their joined hands. "Stetson," he said, standing up. "I was just reviewing some vendor files. Due diligence, you know." "I know exactly what you're doing, Garrett," Stetson said, his voice dangerously calm. He finally let go of Flora's hand and walked to the head of the table, standing opposite his rival. "And it's over." He tapped a button on the table's console. "Beatrice," he said into the speaker, "please get the entire executive committee on a conference call. Now." Garrett's face went pale. "Stetson, what is this?" "This is a reallocation of resources," Stetson said. To Flora he gestured to a chair. "Please, sit." She sat, feeling like a spectator at a championship chess match. One by one, the faces of the company's most powerful executives popped up on the large screen at the end of the room. "Gentlemen," Stetson began, his voice commanding the absolute attention of everyone, both in the room and on the screen. "Effective immediately, I am announcing a change in the leadership structure of the Kendall Industries Foundation Gala." Garrett looked like he was going to be sick. Given the deeply personal nature of this year's theme and its profound importance to the legacy of this company, Stetson continued, "I have decided to take a more direct, hands-on role. I will be co-chairing the committee personally." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "And I will be doing so alongside our new director of Botanical Aesthetics, Miss Flora Daniels." A collective, virtual gasp went through the executives on the screen. Flora herself felt the air leave her lungs. "Co-chair? Her?" Miss Daniels has shown an unparalleled ability to translate this company's core values into a tangible, powerful vision, Stetson declared, his gaze sweeping across the faces on the screen before landing on Flora. The look he gave her was filled with unwavering trust and a deep, profound respect that went far beyond professional admiration. Her leadership is integral to the success of this event. As co-chairs, she and I will have final and absolute authority over all creative and budgetary decisions. All vendor contracts, including that of Petal and Stem, are approved by our authority, effective now. He turned his gaze back to Garrett. It was a checkmate. Garrett was cornered, stripped of all his power in a single, brilliant move. He couldn't audit his own boss. "Garrett," Stetson said, his voice now dangerously soft, "you will, of course, remain on the committee. You will offer your full and enthusiastic support to Ms. Daniels in any capacity she requires. Is that understood?" Garrett Stone, his face a mask of humiliated fury, could only manage one choked word. "Yes." "Excellent," Stetson said with a chilling smile. "That will be all, gentlemen." He ended the call, and the screen went black. He turned to Flora, the hardness in his face melting away, replaced by a look of gentle concern. "Are you okay?" Flora could only nod, her mind reeling. He hadn't just protected her. He had elevated her. He had taken her from a target and turned her into a queen. He had put his own reputation on the line and tied his success directly to hers, in front of his entire company. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes," he said, walking over to her, his voice low and intimate. "I did." He stopped in front of her chair, looking down at her. The boardroom was silent, the city a glittering tapestry behind him. "I told you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You're not chaos, you're clarity, and I'm not going to let anyone dim your light." He reached out and, with a startling gentleness, tucked a stray curl behind her ear. His fingers brushed against her cheek, and the world seemed to stop. They were so close, the space between them humming with an energy that was both terrifying and wonderful. She could see the flecks of gold in his eyes, the slight tremor in his hand. He was going to kiss her. She was sure of it. She wanted him to. And then the spell was broken by the discreet cough of Beatrice Vance standing in the doorway. "Sir," she said, her face a perfect mask of professionalism. Your 4 o'clock is here. Stetson pulled his hand back, as if he'd been burned, a faint blush creeping up his neck. Flora's own face felt hot. Of course, he said, his voice a little hoarse. He cleared his throat and stepped back, becoming the CEO once more. Flora, co-chair, I'll see you at the planning meeting tomorrow. I'll be there, she said, her voice a little breathless. She practically floated out of the boardroom, her mind a whirlwind of patty melts, corporate takedowns, and the ghost of his touch on her skin. She had come to the tower that day, just hoping to keep her job. She was leaving as the second most powerful person on the most important project of the year. And she was beginning to suspect that the project she was most invested in had nothing to do with flowers at all. The week of the gala was a symphony of controlled chaos. Flora lived and breathed the event, fueled by coffee, adrenaline, and an unwavering sense of purpose. As co-chair, she wasn't just the florist anymore. She was a general, marshalling her troops of caterers, lighting technicians, and event staff. And at her side, to the continual astonishment of the entire company, was her fellow general, Stetson Kendall. He was a revelation. The man who ran a global empire with ruthless efficiency applied the same laser focus to floral arrangements. He didn't just approve her decisions, he participated in them. He would join her on late-night walkthroughs of the grand ballroom, which was slowly being transformed from a vast, empty space into the enchanted garden of his mother's dreams. They would stand together under the half-constructed weeping willow, its bare metal branches waiting for their skin of bark and leaves, and they would argue, with a surprising amount of passion, about the precise shade of blue for the uplighting. It needs to be the color of the sky just after the sun has set, but before the stars are fully out, he'd insist, describing a specific, intangible moment from his memory. You mean periwinkle, Flora would say, holding up a color swatch. Yes, he'd exclaim, a look of pure delight on his face. Periwinkle. I knew there was a word for it. They used his mother's journal as their Bible. Every decision was cross-referenced with Eleanor's elegant script. When the caterer suggested a modern, deconstructed strawberry cheesecake for dessert, Flora flipped through the journal and found an entry from a long-ago summer. Stetson picked a whole basket of wild strawberries today, Eleanor had written, so proud of his haul. We made a proper English trifle, with ladyfingers and real custard. He ate 3 helpings. A boy after my own heart. We're having trifle, Flora announced to the chef, closing the book with a definitive snap. Stetson, who had been listening from the corner, just smiled. He hadn't had trifle since he was 10 years old. Garrett Stone was a constant, sullen presence at the edges of their work. He attended every meeting, his face a mask of forced civility. He no longer challenged Flora openly. Stetson's public declaration had made that impossible. But he watched. He watched every decision, every interaction, his eyes missing nothing. He was a snake coiled in the corner, waiting. Flora could feel his resentment like a cold draft, but she was too busy, too exhilarated, to let it bother her. One evening, 2 nights before the gala, they were the last 2 people in the ballroom. The transformation was nearly complete. The weeping willow stood at the center of the room, its branches now covered in realistic bark and dripping with thousands of tiny, fiber-optic lights that twinkled like captured stars. The whispering walkway was in place, a winding path of real grass and fragrant herbs. The air smelled of jasmine, lavender, and damp earth. It was magical. Flora was on a ladder, carefully adjusting a spray of moonflowers on the willow's branches. Stetson stood below, holding the ladder steady. You know, he said, his voice quiet in the vast empty room, I haven't been able to look at pictures of my mother since she passed. It was too difficult. Flora paused, looking down at him. The soft periwinkle light caught the serious, vulnerable lines of his face. But this, he continued, looking around the room, not at the flowers, but at the feeling they created. This doesn't feel like looking at a picture. It feels like stepping into a memory. It feels like she's here. He looked up at her, his eyes shining with an emotion so raw and honest it made her breath catch. I can never thank you enough for that, Flora. You don't have to, she whispered. It's been an honor. He reached up and placed a hand on her ankle. His touch meant to be steadying, but it sent a jolt of warmth straight through her. Be careful up there. Always, she said, her voice a little shaky. She finished adjusting the flower and carefully climbed down the ladder. When she reached the bottom, she was standing very close to him. The space between them was charged, the air thick with unspoken words and the scent of night-blooming flowers. "There's something I never told anyone," he said, his voice a low murmur. "About the last gala, the one before she got sick." He didn't move away. He just looked into her eyes, trusting her with a story he had clearly held close for a long time. "We had an argument, a stupid one, about the business. I was pushing for a merger she thought was too aggressive. I was arrogant. I told her she didn't understand the modern market. She just looked at me with this sad, disappointed expression and said, 'Don't forget to be kind, Stetson. It's the only part of the balance sheet that matters in the end.' I was supposed to give the opening speech with her that night, but I made an excuse. I said I was too busy. I let her go out on that stage alone." A shadow of deep, profound regret passed over his face. It was the last gala she ever attended, and I wasn't there at her side. I've regretted it every single day since. "Oh, Stetson," Flora said, her heart breaking for him. She reached out without thinking and placed her hand on his arm. "She knew you loved her. That one moment doesn't erase a lifetime of love." "I know," he said, his voice thick. "But this year, I get to stand on that stage and tell everyone about the woman who taught me about balance sheets and kindness. I get to make it right." He covered her hand with his own, his thumb stroking her skin. "And I couldn't have done it without you." The distance between them had vanished. He leaned in and she tilted her face up to his. This was it. The moment she had been replaying in her mind since the boardroom. The culmination of all the shared glances, the quiet laughter, the unexpected partnership. His eyes searched hers, asking a silent question. She answered by leaning in just a fraction of an inch more. His lips were about to meet hers when a loud crash echoed from the back of the ballroom. They jumped apart. The spell shattered. A janitor had dropped a metal bucket, the sound amplified 100 times in the cavernous space. "My apologies, Mr. Kendall. Miss Daniels," the janitor called out, his face red with embarrassment. The moment was gone. Stetson cleared his throat and took a step back, the professional mask sliding partially back into place. "It's late," he said, his voice a little strained. "We should go. Big day tomorrow." "Right," Flora said, her own voice breathless. "The big day." The night of the gala arrived in a flurry of tuxedos, glittering gowns, and the soft pop of champagne corks. Flora stood near the entrance, dressed in a simple, elegant dark green dress that made her feel like a wood nymph who had stumbled into a palace. She watched as hundreds of Chicago's wealthiest and most powerful citizens walked into the ballroom, their conversations dying on their lips as they took in the scene. There were audible gasps. People didn't just look at the arrangements. They experienced them. They touched the soft moss, breathed in the fragrant air, and looked up at the twinkling weeping willow with expressions of childlike wonder. Flora saw Mr. Tanaka and the Mitsui delegation near the whispering walkway, their stern business faces replaced with serene smiles. It was more than she could have ever dreamed. It was perfect. Stetson found her by the entrance, looking impossibly handsome in a classic black tuxedo. He looked every bit the part of the corporate king, but when he looked at her, his eyes were full of a soft, private warmth. "Well, Director," he said, his voice a low murmur in her ear. "You promised me a showstopper. This is a masterpiece. She would have loved it." "We made it a masterpiece," she corrected him, her heart swelling with pride. "In a few minutes, you and I have to go up on that stage and welcome everyone," he said. "Feeling brave?" "Terrified," she admitted with a shaky laugh. "But I'm in good company." "The best," he said, his gaze lingering on her. "Before we go up, there's something I want to show you. The final piece. It just arrived." He led her through a small, hidden door behind the main stage. It opened into a small, private alcove she had designed as a quiet space, away from the noise of the party. In the center of the alcove, on a simple pedestal, was a single, perfect flower in a crystal vase. It was a night-blooming Sirius. Its enormous white petals were fully unfurled, a starburst of impossible beauty, releasing a sweet, intoxicating perfume into the air. It was in full, glorious bloom. "How?" Flora breathed, completely stunned. "They only bloom for one night. The chances of it being tonight?" "I had our company's top botanist working on it for months," Stetson explained, his eyes fixed on the flower. He used a climate-controlled chamber to simulate the exact conditions needed to encourage it to bloom tonight. It was my mother's favorite, the star on Earth. I wanted her to be here. Tears pricked Flora's eyes. It was the most thoughtful, most beautiful gesture she had ever seen. It was a gesture of love, of memory, of hope. It was the heart of the entire evening, hidden away for only them to see. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," she whispered. "Almost," he said, his gaze shifting from the flower to her. The moment was back, the quiet intimacy, the unspoken question. This time there were no janitors, no meetings. He reached for her, his hand cupping her cheek, and leaned down. "Stetson, Flora, it's time." Simon's frantic voice came through the slightly ajar door. The show was about to begin. Stetson let out a sigh that was half frustration, half amusement. "The universe," he murmured, "has a terrible sense of timing." "Or a great sense of suspense," she countered, her heart hammering. They shared one last look before stepping back out into the bright lights. They walked toward the stage, a united front. As they stood in the wings, waiting for their introduction, Flora felt a hand slip into hers. It was Stetson's. He gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. The announcer's voice boomed through the ballroom. "And now, please welcome the co-chairs of this year's Kendall Industries Foundation Gala, Mr. Stetson Kendall and Miss Flora Daniels." A wave of applause washed over them as they stepped into the spotlight. Flora looked out at the sea of faces, all looking up at her, and at the magical garden she had brought to life. It was a fairy tale. And then, her fairy tale turned into a nightmare. From her vantage point on the stage, she could see something she hadn't seen from the floor. A faint, glistening sheen on the leaves of the jasmine vines that formed the beautiful, fragrant, whispering walkway. And she saw something else. A few of the older, elegantly dressed women who had just passed through the walkway were dabbing at their eyes and coughing delicately into their handkerchiefs. Her blood ran cold. She knew that sheen, she knew that smell, which was just now reaching the stage. A faint, acrid, chemical scent hiding beneath the jasmine. It was horticultural oil. A pesticide. But not just any oil. It was a heavy, non-organic, industrial-grade solution. The kind used to kill stubborn infestations. It was cheap, effective, and it had a notorious side effect. When it warmed up under event lighting, it released a fine, airborne vapor that was a powerful irritant to sensitive skin, eyes, and lungs. Someone had sprayed the walkway. Her eyes scanned the crowd frantically and landed on Garrett Stone. He was standing near the back, watching her, a glass of champagne in his hand. He wasn't smiling. He was just watching. His eyes cold and flat. He saw her looking, and he ever so slightly raised his glass in a mock toast. He had done it. He had found a way to destroy her that had nothing to do with budgets. He had poisoned her garden. In a few minutes, as more people passed through the walkway, the irritation would become more pronounced. The coughing would start. The beautiful, fragrant tribute to Eleanor Kendall would become an infamous disaster, remembered only as the night Kendall Industries made all its biggest donors sick. And it would be all her fault. She was the director of Botanical Aesthetics. She was the co-chair. The plants were her responsibility. She looked at Stetson, who was just starting to speak into the microphone, his face beaming with pride. He had no idea. He was about to praise a masterpiece, not knowing it was a beautiful, fragrant, ticking time bomb. Stetson's voice was a smooth, confident melody flowing over the rapt audience. He spoke of his mother's passion, her belief in the power of a single story to change a child's life. He was charming, he was poignant, he was perfect. And all Flora could see was the faint, oily shimmer on the jasmine leaves and the slow, creeping poison of Garrett's revenge. Her mind raced faster than her heart. She had seconds. What were her options? She could run off the stage, find Simon, and try to discreetly evacuate the walkway. But that would cause a panic. She could interrupt Stetson, whisper in his ear, but that would make them both look flustered and unprofessional. The damage would still be done. Or she could do the unthinkable. She looked at Stetson, at his proud, happy face, and she knew what she had to do. It was her turn to be the crisis management consultant. It was her turn to make a call that was illogical, insane, and completely necessary. She took a deep breath, stepped forward, and gently laid her hand on his forearm. Stetson stopped. Mid-sentence. 1,000 people held their breath. A ripple of confusion and surprise went through the ballroom. In the wings, she could see Arthur's face turn sheet white. Stetson looked down at her hand, then up at her face. His expression was one of pure, unadulterated shock. "Flora?" he murmured, his voice barely audible but picked up by the sensitive microphone, a whisper that echoed through the vast room. "Trust me," she whispered back, her eyes pleading with him. "Just trust me." It was the ultimate test. Everything they had built, in the revolving door, in the greenhouse, in the diner, came down to this single, terrifying moment. He was on stage, the CEO, the king in his castle. She was interrupting him, humiliating him, breaking every rule of corporate etiquette. He had every reason to be furious, to dismiss her, to have security escort her off the stage. He looked into her eyes, wide with a fear that wasn't for herself, but for him, for the event, for his mother's memory. He saw the frantic, brilliant mind behind her eyes working, calculating. He saw the woman who had turned a disaster into a legend, who had coaxed color from his world of gray. He saw his partner. He made his decision. He turned back to the microphone, his expression shifting from shock to a serene, unshakable calm. He placed his own hand over hers on his arm, a public gesture of unity. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice as smooth as ever, "it seems my brilliant co-chair has just reminded me that a truly great event, like a great story, needs a moment of spontaneity." He smiled at Flora, a real smile of pure absolute faith. "Miss Daniels has an inspiration. The floor is yours, director." He stepped back, ceding the stage, the spotlight, the entire evening, to her. It was the most terrifying and wonderful act of trust she had ever experienced. Flora stepped up to the microphone, her knees trembling. She looked out at the sea of expectant faces. She saw Garrett stone, his expression now one of confused fury. He had expected her to fail, not to take center stage. "Good evening," she began, her voice a little shaky. "Mr. Kendall spoke of his mother's love for her English garden at midnight. He spoke of its magic. But the true magic of a garden at night isn't just what you see, it's what you feel." She took a breath, finding her strength. "It's the cool, fresh air on your skin. It's the real scent of jasmine carried on a midnight breeze. The architect of this beautiful ballroom gave us a gift," she said, pointing up toward the far end of the room. "A wall of glass doors that opens onto the grand terrace. They are almost never opened for this event, for fear of disturbing the controlled environment." She smiled. But Eleanor Kendall was not a fan of controlled environments. She loved the wild, the real, the authentic. "So, in her honor, let's do something a little different. Let's let the midnight in." She nodded to Simon, who was standing in the wings, looking at her as if she'd just grown a second head. She made a clear, decisive gesture with her hands. "Open the doors, all of them." Simon looked at Stetson, who gave a firm, commanding nod. That was all Simon needed. He spoke into his headset, and a moment later, with a soft hydraulic hiss, the entire back wall of the ballroom, 100 feet of glass, began to slide open. A collective gasp went through the crowd. A cool, fresh breeze from the terrace swept into the room, carrying the scent of the city and the clear night sky. It swirled through the whispering walkway, catching the irritating vapor from the pesticide and harmlessly dissipating it into the vast open air. The fragrant scent of the real jasmine, now clean and pure, filled the room. The effect was instantaneous and breathtaking. The enchanted indoor garden was suddenly merged with the glittering, real-life skyline of Chicago. The twinkling lights of the willow now blended with the distant stars. It was no longer a simulation of a garden at midnight. It was real. The audience was on its feet, applauding thunderously. It was a show-stopping moment, a piece of event-planning genius born of pure, desperate necessity. Flora stepped back from the microphone, her legs feeling like jelly. Stetson was at her side instantly, his hand on her back, steadying her. "Clarity," he whispered in her ear, his voice thick with awe. "Absolute clarity." As the applause continued, they slipped away from the stage. "I need to see Garrett," Stetson said, his voice now cold as ice. "You don't have to come." "Oh, yes I do," Flora said, her own anger returning. "This is my garden he tried to poison." They found him in a service corridor, trying to slip out unseen. Stetson blocked his path. "A clever little scheme, Garrett," Stetson said, his voice low and menacing. "Horticultural oil. Just enough to cause irritation, to create a panic. Plausible deniability. You could blame the supplier, blame the new director's inexperience." Garrett paled. "I don't know what you're talking about." Don't you? Flora said, stepping forward. The supplier I used for those vines is a small, organic-only family farm. They wouldn't have a bottle of industrial-grade pesticide if their lives depended on it. Which means someone had to bring it in. Someone who knew it would be untraceable. Someone who knew it would make me look incompetent. This is insane, Garrett blustered. You have no proof. I have the security footage from the loading bay last night showing one of your assistants carrying in an unmarked canister, Stetson said, his voice flat. And I have the testimony of the janitor who you paid to spray it, who came to my head of security an hour ago, terrified he was going to be blamed for making people sick. It's over, Garrett. Garrett Stone's composure finally shattered, his face twisted into a mask of pure, bitter hatred. She made a fool of me, of all of us. You handed her the keys to the kingdom because she got stuck in a door with you. No, Stetson corrected him, his voice filled with a quiet finality. I handed them to her because while you were busy calculating your own advancement, she was busy reminding me what this company is supposed to be about. Creativity, integrity, and joy. He nodded to two security guards who had appeared silently behind Garrett. He's fired. Escort him out, and make sure he understands that if I hear his name connected with any of our donors or partners ever again, our legal team will dismantle his life, piece by piece. The guards took a stunned Garrett by the arms and led him away. The fight was over. The villain was vanquished. Stetson turned to Flora in the quiet corridor. The distant sound of the party of music and laughter drifted toward them. So, he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, my co-chair, you saved the party, you unmasked the villain, and you literally let in a breath of fresh air. All in a day's work? Something like that? She said, her adrenaline finally beginning to fade, leaving a warm, buzzing exhaustion in its place. I believe we were interrupted, he said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate murmur that made her toes curl. He led her back through the hidden door into the private alcove. The night-blooming Sirius was still there, a perfect, glowing star in the quiet dark. The sounds of the party were muffled, a distant heartbeat. Twice, Flora corrected him softly. We were interrupted twice. Then I suppose the third time's the charm, he said. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He stepped closer, cupping her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. He looked into her eyes, and in them she saw everything. The gratitude, the admiration, the relief, and something deeper, something that had been growing between them since the moment a door had refused to budge. He lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't a tentative, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of certainty. It was warm and gentle, and it tasted faintly of champagne and chocolate trifle. It was the end of a long, crazy, impossible day, and the beginning of something new and wonderful. It was all the unspoken words, all the shared glances, all the private jokes, finally given a voice. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. Wow, she whispered, her forehead resting against his. Wow, he agreed. So what happens now, boss? She asked, a teasing light in her eyes. I think, he said, his lips brushing against hers again, you should stop calling me that. He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. My mother's journal has an empty page at the end. I think we have a new story to write in it. He led her out of the alcove, back toward the terrace. They stepped out into the cool night air, under the real stars, the sound of music and laughter washing over them. The enchanted garden was full of life, full of joy. His world wasn't gray anymore. It was bursting with color. And standing there, holding his hand, Flora knew her world had just gotten infinitely bigger. They had started as strangers, trapped in a glass box, and now the whole sky was open to them. What did you think of the story of Stetson and Flora? On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate their journey from a jammed revolving door to an enchanted garden? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And for everyone who has stayed with us until the very end, who believes that clarity can be found in chaos, and that the best partnerships are forged in the most unexpected places, please comment Midnight Garden. We are so grateful to share these stories with you. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more narratives that will change the world.